I still remember the exact moment my mother-in-law pointed at me across the dining room table and called me a gold digger. The room went completely silent. My husband froze. My father-in-law smirked like he had finally won an argument he'd been having in his head for years. And then my sister-in-law laughed and said, "We all know why she's here. She saw money and grabbed her chance." What none of them knew was that the house we were sitting in, the massive house they constantly bragged about to their friends, the house they acted like was the crown jewel of the family, actually belonged to them. It belonged to me. And they were about to find that out in the most humiliating way possible. So tell me honestly, if your in-laws spent years treating you like garbage, accusing you of using their son for money, and disrespecting you in your own home, would you have done what I did? To understand how everything reached that point, I need to go back about 6 years. I met my husband Daniel when we were both working for the same company. I was 28 at the time and had spent most of my 20s building my career. My parents weren't wealthy, but they had taught me the value of hard work and financial responsibility. I saved aggressively, invested carefully, and avoided debt whenever possible. By the time I met Daniel, I had already purchased a small rental property and built a decent investment portfolio. Daniel was kind, funny, and incredibly down-to-earth. Unlike many of the people in our office, he didn't care about showing off. We became friends first, then started dating. Our relationship moved naturally and comfortably. He knew I was financially stable, but we rarely discussed exact numbers because neither of us cared much about money beyond having enough to live comfortably. The problem wasn't Daniel. The problem was his family. I met them about 6 months into our relationship. The moment I walked into their house, I could feel the judgment. His mother, Karen, looked me up and down like she was evaluating an unwanted job applicant. His father, Richard, barely acknowledged me. His younger sister, Ashley, spent the entire evening scrolling through her phone and occasionally throwing sarcastic comments into conversations. At first, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were protective. Maybe they were nervous. Maybe first impressions were just awkward. Then Karen asked what my parents did for a living. When I answered honestly, explaining that my father had been a mechanic and my mother worked as a school secretary, her smile tightened. "Oh," she said, "well, that's humble." I knew exactly what she meant. Things only got worse from there. Every family gathering became a subtle interrogation. Karen constantly asked questions about my finances, my upbringing, and my future plans. She disguised insults as compliments. "You're surprisingly well-spoken. You dress nicely considering your background. It's wonderful that Daniel doesn't care where someone comes from." Each comment was like a tiny paper cut. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they became impossible to ignore. Daniel noticed it too. He confronted his mother several times. Karen always denied everything. "You're imagining things." I was being nice. "She's too sensitive." The classic excuses. When Daniel proposed 2 years later, Karen looked devastated. I wish I were exaggerating. The woman actually cried. Not happy tears. Real disappointment. She pulled Daniel aside during the engagement party and spent nearly an hour trying to convince him he was making a mistake. Unfortunately for her, Daniel loved me and refused to listen. We got married 8 months later. The wedding was beautiful. The drama wasn't. Karen spent most of the reception telling anyone who would listen that the marriage was moving too quickly. Richard complained about the cost, even though he hadn't paid for anything. Ashley showed up late and left early. After the honeymoon, Daniel and I started looking for a larger home. What his family didn't know was that several years earlier, one of my investments had performed far better than expected. Combined with my savings and rental income, I had accumulated enough wealth to make a substantial property purchase. When we found our dream house, I paid the entire down payment. A very large down payment. The mortgage and ownership structure were arranged primarily under my financial portfolio, because it made the most sense legally and financially. Daniel was completely comfortable with that arrangement. We viewed marriage as a partnership. His name didn't need to be on every asset for him to feel secure. The house became our home. At least that's what I thought. The moment Karen saw the property, her attitude somehow got worse. The house was significantly nicer than anything she expected us to afford. Instead of being happy, she became suspicious. According to her logic, there were only two possibilities. Either Daniel was secretly wealthy, or I was somehow manipulating him. Guess which explanation she chose. For years, she told anyone who would listen that I had trapped her son. Family gatherings became exhausting. Every achievement I accomplished was somehow credited to Daniel. Every purchase we made was supposedly funded by him. Every success belonged to him. Every problem belonged to me. Then came the comments about the house. Karen started referring to it as Daniel's house. Not our house. Not their homes. Daniel's house. At first I corrected her politely. Then I stopped bothering. Nothing changed. The worst part was that she began inviting herself over constantly. Sometimes she would show up without calling. Sometimes she would bring relatives. Sometimes she'd give tour. Actual tour. I came home from work one afternoon to find 6 strangers walking through my kitchen, while Karen proudly showed them around. When I asked what was happening, she acted offended. We're family. As though that explained everything. Daniel finally confronted her. The visits became less frequent. But the disrespect never stopped. Then came the dinner that changed everything. Karen announced she wanted to host a large family gathering. Since our house was the biggest, she volunteered it on our behalf without asking. I wasn't thrilled, but Daniel convinced me to let it go. It'll keep the peace, he said. Famous last words. The evening started normally enough. Relatives arrived. People ate. Conversations flowed. I did most of the cooking while Karen accepted compliments, as though she had prepared everything herself. Then someone asked about the house. A cousin mentioned how beautiful it was. Karen immediately jumped into the conversation. Daniel has done very well for himself. I felt my jaw tighten. The cousin smiled. You both have. Before I could respond, Ashley laughed. Let's be honest, we know who benefited most from this arrangement. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Then Karen decided to double down. Well, some women know how to pick successful men. The room went quiet. I looked at Daniel. He looked furious. Before he could speak, Richard joined in. At least she's smart enough to secure her future. And then came the sentence that pushed me over the edge. Karen pointed directly at me. Gold diggers usually are. Silence. Absolute silence. I had spent years biting my tongue. Years avoiding conflict. Years taking the high road. Something inside me finally snapped. I stood up slowly. I remember everyone staring at me. Waiting. Expecting me to cry. Or leave. Or argue. Instead, I smiled. A very calm smile. Then I asked Karen a simple question. Do you really believe I married Daniel for money? She crossed her arms. If the shoe fits. I nodded. Interesting. Daniel was staring at me now because he knew that tone. He knew I was done being patient. I looked around the room. Every relative. Every guest. Every person who had heard years of lies. Then I said, before I continue, I want all of you to understand something. And this is where I want to ask you something too. Imagine being in my position. Years of insults, years of disrespect, years of being treated like an outsider in your own marriage. Would you expose the truth publicly, or would you stay quiet one more time? Comment below what you would have done, because at that moment I had a choice, and the decision I made changed everything. I walked over to my office. Everyone watched. Nobody knew what I was doing. A minute later, I returned carrying a folder. I placed it on the dining table. Karen rolled her eyes. What is this? I opened the folder. Inside were copies of the ownership documents. Mortgage records, purchase agreements, financial statements, everything. I slid them across the table. Read them. She looked confused. Richard grabbed the papers first. His expression changed almost immediately. Then it changed again. Then again. The color drained from his face. Karen noticed. What? He didn't answer. Ashley leaned over his shoulder. Her eyes widened. What is that? Richard finally spoke. His voice sounded strained. The house. He stopped. I waited. The house is hers. Nobody said anything. You could have heard a pin drop. Karen grabbed the documents. She scanned the pages. Then scanned them again. Then a third time. Like she thought the words might rearrange themselves into something she preferred. They didn't. The ownership records clearly showed that I owned the property. Not Daniel. Me. The mortgage existed because it made financial sense, but the primary ownership and funding were mine. The down payment had come from my investments. The financial records proved it. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Everything was undeniable. Karen looked completely stunned. But Daniel finally spoke. I told you years ago to stop making assumptions. Ashley looked horrified. One relative started laughing. Then another. Then another. Not because the situation was funny. Because the irony was unbelievable. For years they had called me a gold digger while sitting in a house I paid for. Karen tried desperately to recover. Well, ownership doesn't mean. I interrupted her. No, let's finish this conversation. The room became quiet again. I wasn't yelling. That made it worse. I was calm. Controlled. Certain. You've spent years telling people I married Daniel for money. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. You've insulted my family. Karen looked away. You've disrespected me in my own home. Ashley stared at the table. And tonight you called me a gold digger. Nobody argued. Nobody defended them. Because they couldn't. The facts were sitting right there. Then I delivered the line that ended everything. If I wanted money, I chose the wrong spouse. A few relatives burst out laughing. Even Daniel struggled not to smile. Richard looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Karen stood up. I think we're leaving. I nodded. I think that's a good idea. For the first time in years, she had no comeback. No excuse. No clever remark. Nothing. The family gathering ended quickly after that. Guests left. Whispers spread. Phones started buzzing. By the next day, the entire extended family knew what happened. Apparently, several relatives had believed Karen's version of events for years. Now they felt manipulated. Some were angry. Some were embarrassed. Some called me personally to apologize. Karen didn't. Instead, she disappeared for nearly 3 weeks. No calls. No texts. No surprise visits. Honestly, it was wonderful. Eventually, she reached out to Daniel. Not to apologize. To complain. According to her, I had humiliated her. Daniel's response was simple. No, you humiliated yourself. I don't think she expected that. The relationship between Daniel and his parents became strained after that. Not because of me. Because he finally saw how deeply their behavior had affected our marriage. For years he had tried to keep the peace. Now he realized peace had only existed for one side. We started setting boundaries. Real boundaries. No unannounced visits. No insults. No passive-aggressive comments. No exceptions. The first few months were rough. Karen fought every rule. Richard complained constantly. Ashley played the victim. But eventually they understood something important. Access to our lives was a privilege, not a right. Over time, things improved slightly. Not perfect, just better. Karen never gave a full apology. I don't think she's capable of one. But she stopped calling me names. She stopped spreading rumors. She stopped pretending I was some opportunist who had manipulated her son. The truth had finally cornered her. And there was nowhere left to hide. The funny thing is that none of this was ever about the house. I didn't care about proving I had money. I didn't care about impressing anyone. The house simply represented something bigger. Respect. For years they judged me based on assumptions. They decided who I was before they bothered getting to know me. They saw my background and created a story that fit their prejudices. Then reality shattered that story in front of everyone. Looking back now, I don't regret exposing the truth. I regret staying silent for so long. Sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness. Sometimes they think patience means permission. And sometimes the only way to stop disrespect is to confront it directly. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that you never truly know someone's story. Wealth isn't always visible. Success doesn't always look the way people expect. And making assumptions about others can backfire in spectacular fashion. So that's my story about the night my in-laws called me a gold digger until they learned who really owned the house. Like this video if you think I was justified. Subscribe for more stories like this. And most importantly, tell me in the comments, if you were sitting at that table, would you have exposed the truth the way I did, or would you have handled it differently? I genuinely want to know. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all in the next story.